Today's episode of Back to the Roots podcast is brought to you by Albert Lee Seed. Here at Back to the Roots, it is our goal to create connections with organic farmers across the country. Now we'd like to connect you with a leading provider of organic and non-GMO farm seed in Albert Lee Seed. Cover crops, forages, small grains, corn, and soybeans. Albert Lee Seed is helping organic and transitioning farmers diversify their crop rotations and create healthy herds, healthy soil, and healthy humans. Whether you're looking for organic oats for cover cropping, highly digestible alfalfa, or a 105-day non-GMO corn hybrid, Albert Lee has got you covered. In fact, they were the first farm seed company in the industry to offer guaranteed levels of non-GMO purity in their Viking corn and soybean line. Check out their website at www.alseed.com to see their farm seed lineup or to request a catalog. And thank you to Albert Lee Seed. You're listening to Back to Roots podcast. This is Brian Wood, and Mike Klein and I are sitting down today with Dr. Larry Tranel, who is the dairy specialist for Iowa State University Extension. And thanks a lot for joining us, Larry. If you want to just start with the introduction, where you're from, background, that kind of thing, that'd be great.
Okay, so I'm from southwest Wisconsin, so I kind of grew up as a dairy farm kid in that area. Went to school at UW-Platteville, where I got degrees in agribusiness, ag economics, international studies, my master's as well. Also a psychology background, so my doctorate's actually in psychology. So I do a lot of farm stress, but also farm financial management type stuff, specifically with dairy farmers. Spent 10 years in the extension system in Wisconsin. In the last 20 years, I've been with Iowa State University Extension, doing a lot of facility type stuff, both robotic milking, low-cost parlors, in addition to a lot of financial, but in the early years, definitely doing a lot of grazing as well. And I would say in the last 10 years, just been really spent a lot of time with the organic producers, especially on the financial side, but also taking a look at different ways for them to improve their operations, especially with labor efficiencies, where the low-cost parlors really have come into play quite dramatically in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. So you've been doing the financial modeling with organic farmers for the last 5 years or so?
Yeah, I would say probably actually for about the last 10 that I've been doing it on farms, but it's only been in the last 5 where I've really worked with Organic Valley and some others like Farmers All Natural in Kelowna, and just as we take a look at looking at their producers and looking at the finances and just kind of really helping them discern, are they making money or not, and what kind of pay price they might need to turn a profit.
Mm-hmm. So what are, I guess, the point of having you on, what observations just general observation, we can take questions kind of wherever from there, but that you've seen in the last 10 years as you've collected numbers and the way that the market has changed, pricing has changed, what have you seen?
Sure. So I think we started collecting data actually back in '93, so I've been doing it for quite some time on farms.
On conventional farms?
Yep. and specifically grazing farms.
Mm-hmm.
And now as a lot of them have turned organic, so we have a lot of data in a couple different systems, and I always kind of take a look at, we've got a lot of conventional farmers that don't think the grazers make any money. The grazers don't think the conventional farms make any money, and the organic people can't believe either one of them makes any money. So you've got 3 different systems out there that can be profitable depending on who the manager is within the systems and just what kind of systems people like. But I think specifically with the organic is kind of an offshoot of a lot of the hybrid grazers that have come, in the early 90s and 2000s, and as organic actually kind of started with, back in Iowa County, Wisconsin, or Richland County, up in that area. So I had a lot of early connection with them. So when you take a look at their finances, it's definitely the profitability has kind of grown over the years. And so these farms have kind of had their ups and downs. It was a struggle early on just because pay prices weren't quite what they were, like say 3 to 5 years ago. And now we've got some downs as some of the pay prices have actually come down a little bit. And so I think farmers have adjusted quite well for the most part during those time frames. But I think as they've done the financial analysis, I think one of the things that they really learn is the difference between profitability and cash flow. And so we've got a lot of farmers, whether they're organic or not, that think that they're profitable, and you do a financial analysis and you find out well, they're not very profitable. They're kind of living off their own labor, or they're living off the equity off the farm, where they should be getting a return on that, whether they're working it or not. So you have some of those things happening. You also have some farmers that, because of tight cash flow, they don't think they're making any money out there, but they do a financial analysis and actually find, well, maybe they're making $20 or $30 an hour and a good 6 or 8% return on their assets. And but they don't feel like they're making it because the cash flow is so tight, just because maybe they bit off more debt than they could handle, or something else is happening family-wise or whatever with family living expenses, that there's just not enough cash flow to go around. So I think the bottom line from what I've learned or tried to teach a lot of the farmers is that, are you making a profit? And if you are, even if you're not, just is cash flow really causing your problem to feel like you're not profitable? But I think those profit analyses have been pretty valuable for farmers.
Mm-hmm. And I know in some of your research, you divide out the high profitability groups, mid profitability groups, and the low profitability groups. And as far as profitability goes, you're getting a number down to an hourly equivalent wage.
Yep.
Correct. And what are some of the things in that, the differences between the high and the low groups that overall that has led to more profitability on farms?
Yeah, that's a great question, because when you take a look at those, a lot of times you'd think it'd be production per cow as being the biggest difference. And sometimes we do find that in some of the studies. And so sometimes there might be a major difference between the high profit and low profit group on production per cow, but we've had other studies where it's actually been the inverse, that some of the lower production herds have actually been more profitable. And so we do find that the labor efficiencies, I always tend to think that that's probably the biggest thing that I try to hang my head on and try to help people understand, is that, especially as a young producer, you really can't afford to be milking 22 cows per person per hour when your competitors are out there milking 65 and even 75 cows per person per hour now. So I think when you take a look at the labor efficiency, that's probably the one thing that I would tend to say is almost always better in the high profit groups, is that they've got better labor efficiency, and they're milking, and it's not to say they're milking more cows, but they're milking more cows with less labor. And when you take a look at the economies of scale, so everybody's always kind of saying, get bigger, get big, get out. And I would tend to say that, from the studies that I've seen, especially the one in what we did in Wisconsin, I think it was 2 years ago, is that if I would actually take a look at all the return to labor and divide that by the number of labor hours being put on that farm, is that the smaller farmers and the middle-sized farmers were actually just as labor efficient, if not more labor efficient, than the bigger farms in Wisconsin. And so when you take a look at the bigger farms, they're making more return for that owner-operator. And everybody says, well, then they're more labor efficient. I say, no, they're not. They're just making more money for themselves, paying other people a lesser wage, and they're making money off the labor, which rightly so. They're managing that labor, and they've got to deal with that labor. But I don't want them to start saying that bigger is better, get out, just because that thought process. These small farms can be some pretty efficient operations as well. In fact, last week I did one that was actually a non-organic farm, but they're milking 50 cows, and they probably had one of the lowest milk production costs, between $12 and $13 in 2019, if you can believe it.
Wow. And
yet have a big cash flow problem because they can't pay off maybe some debt or something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you seen a trend, because when the gold rush in organics, 2015 was an unbelievable year, have you seen where farms got themselves in financial troubles because of the good years?
The easy answer would be yes, because there was a lot of expansion at that time, and so I wouldn't even say it was just organic farms. It's other types of farms as well. Is that when you tend to see the those kind of milk prices, what are you going to do besides you're going to tend to expand? Okay, so so most people expand. So you actually take the question too. As milk prices go down, those costs of production tend to go down as well. Milk prices go up. Funny how cost of production tends to go up as well, because so people tend to spend what they can afford to spend in those costs of production. But as you take a look at like say 3 years ago when milk prices were I'd say pretty plush, okay, what are you going to do with that money? Okay, and they're starting to see, well, if I would milk another 50 cows or maybe even another 100 cows, and and we weren't even talking about quota, I don't think, at that time. If I could do that because they're still looking for all that milk, by all means, why not do that and make a nice little living here in the next, as long as it lasts. Okay, so it's been a tough industry since then, but it was definitely pretty good. That encouraged a lot of investment. And now if I could just even say something like in the conventional market at this point, when people are starting to talk a little light at the end of the tunnel, then maybe by the end of the year we'll see another $1 in the milk check on conventional milk prices. When you start saying that, and we've got other people saying, well, we might even see $20 milk by the end of the year. And if we start saying that, I can almost guarantee we won't see $20 milk, because on just
People
the thought
will
of
expand.
it, people are going to expand and go after it, and it's going to almost ensure that we won't see the $20 milk.
Mm-hmm. So
I never thought of that.
yeah. It's a self-perpetuating, But one of the things in the organic industry, at least, since that's who we primarily work with, outside of getting hit by quota, the farms that expanded back when the gold rush was happening, I wouldn't say the ones that I've talked to, that didn't get them in trouble expanding unless they're getting hit by quota. The part that got people in trouble is that they bought new equipment. They built new facilities, didn't add any cows to pay for those facilities. They just figured the higher pay price was going to carry them through. Now they're dealing with the debt and a lower pay price, and they're dealing with the cash flow issue. That's the what I've seen out there is that's what brought people into problems.
Yeah, so I think it's important that and as you mentioned that, so it is more of a cash flow issue right now. I would not even tend to say it's as much of a profitability issue, because I think those production costs are still pretty close to where those pay prices are, but it's because they took on additional debt and they're trying to expand expand more, and so they create a kind of a cash flow problem with them. And so again, as long as we realize it's a cash flow problem that a lot of producers are having right now.
There's a lot of shiny paint purchased in 15 and 16. A lot of new equipment that, because the money was there, because I don't think anything stimulates a local economy like a farmer with money.
And I agree.
So, yeah, I mean, the local equipment dealers right now around home are hurting. But I remember right after I started working here at Organic Valley, Jim Wiedeberg told me to always remember that high milk prices bankrupt farmers. And what we saw, and I've seen this firsthand with some of the farms I work with, that the organic premium on the milk was big enough to cover poor management. And now as that price has come back down, that mismanagement is really showing. And as we drive out of this and the industry turns around slowly but surely in a couple of years, I think we're going to see farmers way better managers and much better financial operators going forward, simply because it's hard to learn when things are going too well.
Yep.
Well, I just was going to add that it also, the higher pay prices carried, I'm basically restating what you said, but higher pay prices carried poor managers through. So now that pay prices have dropped, we get a lot of complaining. But is that complaining reality of that cost of production is too high versus what they're getting paid? Or is it poor management that can be improved to bring cost of production down? You don't know without getting into the numbers with them.
Right, and I think you both provide a pretty good analysis of just kind of some of the things that have happened, because as those pay prices increased, are you going to pay Uncle Sam more, or are you going to invest back into the farm? And so a lot of that new paint, some of those new buildings came because, I mean, if you're sitting here in a 33-40% tax bracket based on that, so you're getting some stuff pretty darn cheap. So it's either, some people just hate to give the government any money whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And so now we've purchased those things. Yeah, we saved the taxes, but now we have this additional debt that we got to deal with. So it definitely becomes kind of the
you
cash
can't
flow
grow
problem
broke paying taxes, but you sure can trying to avoid them.
Without a doubt. I like the way you said that. There's definitely a lot of truth to that. But so now we're in kind of a scenario, and I think if we, the big bump that we had with those high organic pay prices, and again, thinking this 3 to 5 years ago, just if we wouldn't have had that, we probably wouldn't have this expectation from the farmers that they should be there all the time. Okay, so They don't like that variability. So like in the conventional market, we got this gyration of prices all the time, where the conventional or with the organic, hopefully we can kind of stabilize those prices. And I think the organic industry has done a great job trying to stabilize them as best they could.
But it is a frustration amongst the farmers that's why a lot of farmers got into the organic industry, was the stabilization of pay prices. They were living high on the hog 3 to 5 years ago. And now we are seeing the fluctuations, and it's just, we'd never seen in the organic industry, and part of it is just maturation of the organic industry, but we've never seen this wild of fluctuation in a price. We were at 6 years ago, what were we at, $25 to $30, and then it went up closer to 40. I'm just using general numbers here, but then now we're back to 30 again. So basically there's been no change versus 7 years ago, but we had that high on the hog years.
Yeah, with those high on the hog years, I remember producers saying to me, it's just like, what do you do with all this money? So I think now it's actually kind of back into a level where it's kind of pretty consistent with their cost of production. Sure, some people have a cost of production that's still, substantially over what the current pay price is, but you got to realize there's other ones that have a cost of production that's substantially lower yet too. So on average, I think it's actually pretty close to what the market needs to bear, and hopefully it can bear for the farmers.
Mm-hmm. What would you say in all of your collecting of data as of right now? Well-managed organic dairy cost of production should be at X.
I would say right now you're always going to have a few outliers. So right now you're going to definitely have some outliers that are in that 24 to 27. Your better producers, I would hope, would be in that 27, 28 range. Okay, so but on average you're going to be looking at 29 to 31. But you're going to have that same kind of bell curve on the flip side up there. You're going to have these producers that are going to be in that 32 to 36, kind of on a little bit on the lower side. But you've also got the ones that are way off on the curve, just like we're off on the curve down on the profit side. You're going to have them off the other side. That some of those are still going to be in that $38 to $40 a hundredweight to produce milk. Mm-hmm. So the big thing I think about the studies is that I think it's allowed a lot of producers now to take their information, because they can actually calculate quite a few of those things on their own farm and come back and say, where are my finances a little bit off the benchmark, or maybe way off the benchmark. And if this producer is making $25 or $30 an hour on his farm or her farm, we don't want to be sexist about this. So when you take a look at what they're making, why am I only making $5 an hour, and we've got some that actually have a negative return to labor. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is that when you really take a look at true cost of production, you've got this equity charge. So whether you're paying the bank, and if you're not paying the bank and you own that money yourself, you better be paying yourself. And so I think cash flow wise, we've got a lot of farms out there that cash flow because they don't have much debt. But what are they truly doing? They're living off their equity. And if that's their way of managing that asset, I'm not going to knock that whatsoever. But if you're ever going to compare your farm to somebody else's farm, I've got to account for how much in the way of assets that you have. So if you've got $1 million worth of assets, I'm going to charge you 4.5% interest, again, whether you pay the bank or yourself, but that's a cost of doing business there.
Mm-hmm. You used the term benchmarks there. That was one of the things that was also interesting in those high, mid, and low profitability groups. Some of the benchmarks that stood out as being spent more on high profitability farms, and one of those I use it quite often is the spending more on fertility and making that investment back into the farm rather than spending it on assets or something that isn't going to benefit you long term. Too often when cost of production, or when there's not much money to be made to go around, I should say, the first thing that gets cut is fertility.
Sure,
but they're hurting themselves in the long run.
Yeah, so it's kind of like how much money do you leave on the table with different types of things. And so we've got quite a few producers, and we still have them out in the industry as well, that think they're going to get milk out of the cows without feeding them. And it's the same way with your soils. You think you're going to get a lot of production out of your soils by not feeding the soils, and it's kind of a two-edged sword as you do that. So when you take a look at some of those benchmarks that people always, they focus on these feed costs, and one of the benchmarks that I hate even having in the program is this feed cost per cow, because people focus on that. And so when I take a look at feed cost per cow, and if I ever hear anybody brag about it, I just will set them straight real quick, is that anybody that has the lowest feed cost per cow tends to have the highest feed cost per hundredweight of milk sold. Okay, it works almost the exact opposite. And so, we can have very low production herds that probably tend to have, again, a low feed cost per cow, but for the amount of feed costs that go in for every hundredweight sold, it actually can be pretty high. So those benchmarks, we got to kind of look at them with a grain of salt as well. But I definitely agree with the crop fertility type ones, because we tend to find that there's certain producers out there that tend to have even lower feed costs per cow and fewer acres per cow, and you wonder, how are they doing it? Okay, so our land quality might be a little bit different on farms, and actually could be substantially different on farms, but you know that they're doing a very good job crop management-wise. And so I would tend to say that when you take a look at organic, and especially now that we're starting to deal with some of the grass-fed type ones, is that focus on forage quality is so huge, and it shows up in these benchmarks in just how much their feed costs per hundredweight are, and just how many acres or how many cows they can actually support on how many cows they can support on a certain number of acres. So a lot of times, conventionally, we're looking at 3 to 3.5. A lot of times, organic, we might be 4 or 4.5, just because of lower yields and things like that. But you have some producers out there that can actually milk more cows on fewer acres. And how do they do that besides intensifying that land resource base?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So on farms that you've worked with, is there a big difference in the profitability from the grass milk to the regular organic?
So when you take a look at grass milk, so that's probably one of the I think the light where the light bulbs kind of goes on in my head. So you have some of these grass milk farms out there that are, I tend to say, very profitable. Now, they wouldn't be profitable without that extra $4 or $5 of hundredweight for soil amendments and things like that. So if we're just talking about grass milk and organic milk at the same pay price, yeah, you're probably much better off being just organic. But now if we start taking a look at a $4 or $5 premium, and even if it was only 3 or 3.5, I think it'd still be paying out pretty well for the grass milk ones. But I think what I like about the program, especially what Organic Valley does, is you kind of encourage them to spend the money on soil amendments and making sure they're doing that. So as we go from organic to grass-fed, I mean, what's our big deal here is that instead of just being a good forage manager, you have got to be a superb forage manager, because now where are they going to get that energy? You're not going to be sitting out there feeding these cows rank forage. It's going to be some very high quality forage that's going into them. And so from what I've seen on the studies is that the ones that really pay attention to this forage quality and start being a little bit more aggressive on the grass management and the legume management as well, just to get more energy into it, can actually do a pretty decent job with it. So yeah, we're dropping sometimes 25% of the milk production. And when you take a look at doing that drop, how are you going to make up for some of that volume? So I tend to say, well, let's milk a few more cows in that same system. And it's still going to be a lot easier, especially if you've got a low-cost parlor to milk the cows, where it doesn't take that much longer to milk another 20 or cows or so. So when you take a look at the data, is just there's a few farms that I'm just sitting here thinking, this is what an easy way of life. Not that they don't work hard, but sitting here milking cows twice a day, not having to mess with any TMR mixers, no nothing. We got to get a few bales of baleage out there, and I think that's been kind of a savior for these grass farms, is that they can put up very small quantities of feed that's very high quality in this little baleage form. And so when you take a look at, your day's work, I mean, just what a nice little lifestyle, except for this past winter. If you don't deal with the winters, they could still have that kind of a system. I think they'd have the cat's meow.
But I want to be careful there, because too many farmers we've seen think that they're getting into the grass-fed thing to have this nice little way of life. But it's the management. Like you said, you have to have top-notch forage, and you have to know how to feed it too. And too many times, like I said, people move over because they don't want to deal with planting corn. It's too much work. They got all the time on sitting behind a tractor or sitting with the plow. But if they're not the managers, they will come out behind.
Yep, and I agree. So when you take a look at a lot of these grass farms, it's just I mean, we got to work with the cow as well. So when do cows graze the best? From 6 to 10 in the morning and through the night or whatever. So if you're the type that you say, well, I'm going to get up at 6 or 7 o'clock and I'm going to have my cows milked by 9:30, 10 o'clock and then get them out on pasture, what are they going to do? By 10 o'clock, they're ready to lay down again. So you really need to work with the time management, time clock of the cows themselves. Have this early type scenario, so they do have a lot of just intake of grass, and it's got to be high quality grass from 6 to 10 in the morning, and then they can work with the rest of the day, and especially on hot days. And a lot of these are, as they try to calve them, like maybe spring seasonal or whatever, you just take a look at that, and if you're dealing with the heat, you're not going to get the intake, and you're not going to get the quality on it either. So I think those forage managers, just as they take a look at how do you be a top-notch one, so it's going to be not just working with the timing of the cow, but just that pasture. That that cow looks down at that pasture, they better see a pretty full mouthful when they're going to go down there and take a bite, because they're only going to take so many bites during the day, and if they can't intake it, they're just going to take it off their back, or they're not going to eat it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In collecting the numbers with the grass milk, what you said, 3 to 3.5 conventionally acreage per cow, 4 to 4.5 organically. What have you seen with grass milk?
Okay, so it sounds like my studies are a little different than most others, but what I've seen is that the acres per cow is actually going down a little bit. So now we actually have cows that are actually producing a little bit less, that don't need quite as much acreage. And so now if you're taking a look at a 14,000 pound herd average, and now we're going down to 9 or 10,000, I mean, that's 5 to 6, 7 pounds of dry matter, probably, just estimating, kind of coming off of that. That's going to take fewer acres to actually run that cow. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say, if you're going to do that, I'd much rather see you try to keep the volume up, even though you're not going to get it on a per cow basis, but keep the volume up by milking another 10 or 20% more cows.
That is opposite what what we've been in talking to farmers. One of the holdbacks absolutely is that corn silage tonnage is phenomenal, especially somewhere in the corn belt, Indiana, Wisconsin, where you can really grow corn. And the fear is that we need more acreage to do grass milk with the same number of cows, because we need to get more dry matter off this amount of acreage.
Yeah, if they take a look at just how much, I think it'd be a calculation, because when I was first looking at it, I would say, well, yeah, that's the way it should be. But it really depends. I mean, some producers are, not getting that much, 5.5 ton of dry matter corn silage, which isn't that much. They're getting 3.5 or so off their pasture acres. So as you kind of look at the difference on that, and that corn silage might only be 20 or 30 acres of the whole farm. That might be a couple hundred acres. I bet that difference really isn't as big as people think it might be.
Mm-hmm.
I really like the grass milk farmers that use either a summer annual or a sorghum, male sterile sorghum as silage. It really helps control muns when they hit pasture in the spring, because you don't have that low protein, high energy feed for them. So having that silage really makes sense.
Yep.
If they can do it. Some of them don't want to do that, because that's why they wanted to go grass milk, because they didn't want to cultivate anything in rows. They wanted to get away from the row cropping. But this goes back to your point about forage quality. You don't have the ability to just add 2 pounds of grain if your forage quality is bad.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, so when you take a look at a rotation like that, but we've all got pastures on our farms that every 10 years then you might need to be renovated, and those are good places, I think, to put some of the annuals.
Mm-hmm.
You can definitely up some tonnage, and you're going to need that wintertime feed, and you want to try to keep milk production up, so it's got to be some high-quality baleage probably bought in, or if you can't raise it if you don't have the number of acres, but something else has to happen, yeah.
I think it's so interesting with the grass-fed guys, how they look at forage samples differently now. They used to be trying to buy protein in, high-quality 180 plus RFQ hay with a higher protein. Well, now they're looking for something with low protein, but, an NEL's in the mid to upper 7s. I mean, that's now they're seeing they need to buy energy in. Yep. Don't worry about the protein. The protein will take care of itself. There's options there, but if you're not replacing that grain with, you have to replace that grain with some type of an energy source. And they are using some molasses and some sugars for that, but I don't think that's a long-term solution.
Yeah, and I think just even if they're not grass-fed, you have a lot of grazers out there that are so worried about protein levels when they usually have more protein than they need in some of these rations, and they're still trying to figure out what's the best protein source out there. And I think sometimes they fail to realize that cow actually has to spend even more energy trying to excrete and get rid of that protein because they've got so much of it into the ration. So now we come into this grass-fed type program where people just don't understand that energy is the limiting factor. Until you figure out this energy thing, there's no reason to be dealing with all these other things that you might think are limiting factors until you get enough energy into these cows, because that's what she's craving and that's what she's needing. So whatever we can do to try to work with that. So I definitely wholeheartedly agree is that when I talk about high-quality baleage, when you start taking a look at even 150 relative feed value type baleage is still pretty darn good, and you start getting into 180, and you're trying to feed that to the cow all the time, and that is a lot of protein for that cow that she's got to do something with, and she's got to learn how to process through it. So it takes energy.
There's one loaf, a local grower, that I'm not sure what he does, but his first cutting hay was 194 RFQ. It was a grass alfalfa mix with a protein of 19%, which was low, and an NEL of 0.77. It's like the dream hay for somebody that hits pasture, because you have that rocket fuel hay, but you don't have the protein. You didn't have the 24 to 26% protein. So the guy that bought it was actually Joe Schleybaugh that we had on the podcast, and he's a spring seasonal grass milk producer. So he wants that hay when they hit pasture, that high energy, lower protein, to try to slow it down a little bit. And he called him after he bought it, and he said, every bale of hay you have with those numbers I want. So now the guy is actually trying to make hay to his specs, see if he can replicate it another year.
Yeah, I think that would have a lot of value if you could clone those loads of hay.
Mm-hmm. Have you seen anything with the cost of production on grass milk farms? Is it higher than that bell curve? It just does the bell curve just kind of shift over a little bit, or is it holding pretty steady?
I would tend to say that the grass milk farms that we have in the studies, all pretty darn good producers. And so when you take a look at how much more do they need financially to make this thing tick, I would tend to say it's in that $3.50 range. And so if they're getting $5, I think they've got a nice little reward to be working this system. So when you take a look at total cost of production, I would think if you just take the organic average price and you add about $3.50 onto it, that's kind of what their production cost is. And so instead of having this, by the time I take a look at that, $10 is pretty much a $10 spread on the organic. I'm looking, there's probably only about a $6 spread on the grass-fed ones from where they're producing, but there's not near as many producers in the study either.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think when you take a look at how should producers look at their profitability, so the first way I like to do is just your total cost of production. So to be a profitable farm, if you're getting this as a pay price, your cost of production are under that, which means in that cost of production, you've got your opportunity cost of your labor that's going in that hasn't been paid yet, and you've got a full equity charge. So what you're not paying the bank, the rest of those assets you're paying yourself, and you subtract those two things out, then you get a total cost of production. And if that's positive, then you're covering all your full costs, plus you're getting a little extra profit. So I would use that as a profit definition. The second way I would take a look at profitability is I have this equation where profitability equals price minus cost in parentheses times the volume. So the easy way to look at this equation is your return on assets is pretty much your profit. So if you take a look at, that percentage number, and then you take a look at that being the profit and equals price minus cost. So how do you get your price? So you get your price from your co-op or whoever you're selling, your processor you're selling the milk. You take out all your expenses and you get this price minus cost thing, which is kind of like an operating profit margin. So the OPM, that wasn't a good word to use. We'll cut that one out. Opium. So the operating profit margin is one thing. So grazers and organic producers tend to have a very high strength in operating profit margin. They're smaller herd sizes, and they really work that profit angle that way. So the other part of the equation is times the volume. So that's depicted by our asset turnover ratio. So it takes me, say, 3 years to gross enough income to pay for all the assets on the farm. So that would give me an asset turnover ratio of 33%. So on $1 million worth of assets, that means I need to gross $333,000 every year. Okay, so when you take a look at the volume, which is kind of the big strength of conventional producers, producing 30,000 pounds of milk over 2,000 or 3,000 cows, they only need to make a small margin, operating profit margin per unit or per hundredweight, even if it's only 10 or 18 cents. You put that much volume out there, you can still make some pretty decent money in most years. Okay, so now that's your equation. So you multiply that operating profit margin times your asset turnover ratio, and if you're doing it correctly, you will equal exactly your rate of return on assets. So I would tend to say that that's probably the biggest thing that people should look at, is that they've got production costs per hundredweight equivalent, and we've also got our profit equation, return on assets, which is depicted by operating profit margin times the asset turnover ratio. And the third way is I like to take a look at just what your return to labor. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, but that's one of the biggest things. People know what labor is worth in any locality you're around. So I like to know what people are making per labor hour, because I think that's probably the easiest way for people to relate. What did I actually make this year? I made $19 an hour. I made $25 an hour. I've got dairy producers that are making $100 an hour a year. I've got other ones that would be better off to stay in bed, that they actually have a negative return to labor per hour that they put in. Okay, so that's where the variation, I think, really comes in. So you can compare the labor market to your labor market, the return on assets you can compare to the financial markets. Okay, so sometimes you take a look at these studies and you've got one that might be highest on return to labor. You might have another farm that's highest on return to assets, and you might have another one with the biggest spread between the profit margin, between the cost and the price that they receive. And so which one's more profitable? So sometimes I got to study pretty darn hard which one I think is more profitable, because it might be different in each one of the measurements. But those are the three measurements that I would use.
So we actually have a producer I think you worked with in Ohio that was a once-a-day milker, milks once a day, and is on the grass milk truck. And he shows he's extremely profitable because his labor hours are less. Have you worked with a lot of once-a-day milkers or no?
I would say no, and I can't even say if I worked with that person because it's all confidential. So when you take a look at the...
I didn't mention a name. We're good.
So when you take a look at the those once-a-day milkers, it's a piece of the industry right now that we're actually trying to do a few studies and trying to work with a few farmers, kind of take a look at it. And so when I was out to Vermont last month, there's quite a few that do it out there. So I'm actually trying to find some good samples of people that don't just do it for the lifestyle and whether they make money or not. That's just kind of what they want to do. But people are out there trying to really make money at once-a-day milking. I'd like to kind of get the finances done on a few of those farms just to kind of see what's happening with it, because it could be an option. I know research will show, especially from New Zealand, that cows, if they're Jersey blood or kind of a colored breed, they tend to fare a lot better on once-a-day milking than what a Holstein would.
So once-a-day milking, I guess question would be, what, with the cost of production being where it's at and the current pay pricing being where it's at, obviously there's some people that are negative there, whether it's cash flow or profitability. Where would once a day could be an option to try and bring that profitability and cash flow back into line? What are some other things that you've seen that people could do during these tougher times to lower that cost of production or bring profitability and cash flow?
Okay, so from right now, my understanding on some of the research is that if they do go to once-a-day milking, it's probably going to reduce their cash flow, and it's probably going to reduce their profitability unless they know something about it that I don't, which could easily be a part of the picture out there. Just because, to me, once-a-day milking is something that, maybe somebody can afford to do that because they're a little bit more financially stable and be able to, they don't have the big cash flow needs. So I think they can still be profitable, but they might not have a big high debt load where they need that cash flow to pay somebody back versus paying themselves the 4% on their own equity or whatever. So other things, what can people do at times like this? The biggest thing is I would tend to say is the easiest thing to do is quit buying feed. And sometimes that's the worst thing we can do. So it really needs to be, there's not a lot of, I don't think, excess expenses in a lot of people's feed rations at this day. I mean, if you're talking 10, 15, 20 years ago, I would tend to say that might be an issue. But nowadays, I think these nutritionists that are working with the producers tend to do a pretty darn good job with trying to cut the feed bill as best they can because they want the clients. And
the one thing I've noticed that, the land values can really, really change it because, we have land. If you have an acre of land, you're going to get between 35 and 60,000 an acre for it where I live. Okay. There's no way you can do a financial analysis on a dairy farm to show that you're smarter to be milking than selling your land. It's just, but you can't really look because I believe they use just a common value for all the farms then in Ohio that did an analysis. What do you, if a farmer talks to me and they're struggling and he might as well just sell 20 acres, cash in. How do I convince him that no, he should not carve up the farm because he wants, keep it a farm? I mean, you can't really argue with $60,000 an acre.
Yeah, and so when you start looking at high land prices like that, I mean, I think your psychology as in looking at profitability needs to change a little bit because now you're actually out there managing an asset that when you take a look at even $30,000 an acre land, that still might be increasing at 3 to 5% per year, or sometimes even 6 to 7%. You are managing an asset. So even if I would take a look at 7 and 8%, appreciation, even if you're paying the bank 4%, okay, so you still have a profitable asset out there that's kind of gaining an appreciation. So I think that's a lot different than in some places like Clayton County, Iowa, where you might be, $3,500 an acre or $4,000 an acre. And there it is more just as a farm investment. Okay, but again, I think like 35,000, 60,000, to me it's more an asset management type thing. Well, then I wouldn't be so greedy about saying you have to get this 4% return because you know what's happening with prices, and I suspect they're not going to be coming down anytime shortly with the way the market is there in various places in Ohio and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and it's strictly just because of the population, and business is really booming, and so I think the land prices have kind of plateaued right for now.
Yep.
But I wouldn't want to buy a bunch of investment land right now. But still, a long-term investment in real estate in my area is probably about as safe as it can get. Because it's I've never seen real estate go down in my lifetime.
Yes, I mean, land economics is kind of, you got location, and you're sitting in a pretty good location with it, but you still got to be able to cash flow the purchase of it and still kind of be able to manage the cash flow as you're operating it. So as long as you can work that, I think it's still a pretty good investment. Mm-hmm. So did you want to talk about the parlors a little bit, or?
Yeah, into the efficiencies. I thought that's where you're going to go when you were talking about ways that we could get more profitability on farms. Probably could be through more or less hours spent milking cows in inefficient systems.
Yeah, and so I think as we take a look at like even our supply problems right now, what's the problem is that we have gotten so darn efficient at a lot of it. There's still a lot of milking systems out there that I tend to say have a lot of room for improvement. If I go back to a study that was done in Wisconsin back in the early 2000s, maybe it was in the 1990s yet, after people modernized and they looked at how many cows per person they were milking per hour, and it was still less than 45 and 50 on a lot of those farms. And I'm sitting here, what's happening with this industry? Because we've got 12-year-old kids that can milk 65 cows per person per hour. And there's a lot of other systems nowadays that we're doing with, like I would say one of our best parlors in Iowa right now is milking about 75 cows per person per hour. We've got one in southwest Wisconsin, a Swing 20, where they've got two milkers, and they're averaging 140, 150 cows with two operators in that pit, so kind of the same efficiency. So when you take a look at, and it's not that expensive to actually build those parlors, and so what's the rest of this industry doing here? So when you take a look at even on the robotic milking side, so we've got some costs of production for robotic milkers in that $2 a hundredweight, maybe sometimes even pushing $3, depending on how many pounds of milk they're selling per robot per day. But if we're not in that robotic mindset, there's a very nice option out here with these Trans-Iowa low-cost parlors that as I've traveled with some of the RPMs from Organic Valley across the country, I mean, there's a lot of these in a lot of these states nowadays. In fact, Kentucky says this is probably the most popular parlor being built in Kentucky right now. So when you take a look at it, there's things on the internet, actually a couple of video shows about how you can build your own low-cost parlor, and a lot of operators have just watched that video, and the blueprints are up there, and they've said, well, I think I can do this. And that's kind of the intent of the whole thing. And so I don't think there's really much of an excuse nowadays to not be milking at least in that 60 cows per person per hour. And a very minimum 55, because you can still compete with the rest of the industry, because that's what the big operations in California and other places are actually getting for an efficiency. And so if we take a look at that, and I don't want to knock stall barns. I know a lot of our organic producers are still milking in stall barns, and there's a lot of family reasons and other lifestyle choices they make for doing so. So I'm not knocking that whatsoever. But for those that want to take a look at more efficient ways to milk them, and I think sometimes we take a look at maybe some cow welfare issues that we're seeing in some of these stall barns as well. There might be some other reasons why we might need to move to a different milking system, that we can install a lot of these low-cost parlors right in those stall barns that are going to probably stand. They've been standing for 150 years already. They might stand for another 150 years just because of the way they were built, but it's not that expensive to actually get something like that to happen. So I encourage them, as I take a look at the dairy trans analysis, of this financial analysis that we work with producers, as we take a look at some of those numbers, I can tell on a piece of paper usually, just because of these labor efficiencies that show up 4 or 5 different places. I said, well, I bet you're milking in a stall barn or one of these old herringbone type parlors that just isn't getting much efficiency. So I think there's pretty cheap ways to overcome that. And I say especially for younger producers nowadays, is because when you take a look at these younger producers, they cannot afford, at least in my mind, if they really want to become what I call these millionaire model producers, they can't afford to spend their younger years milking in something that's only half as efficient, or sometimes only as third as efficient as what it could be, because that money that you make in your younger years is some of the biggest money you're going to make in your life. And I like to always share this graph that, when you're young, you can invest in this truck that might cost you $40,000, and it's going to depreciate down to next to nothing after about 25 or a few years. And then, or you can take $2,000 a year from age 22 to age 30, invest $16,000 till you're age 65 at 6% interest, and you're going to have more money than the guy that bought the truck, undoubtedly, but you're also going to have more money than the person that waited till their age 35 and invested $2,000 a year from 35 to 65. And so, spent $60,000 versus the second person that only spent $16,000. The second person that only spent $16,000 is going to have more money than the person that waited till they were 35. So that same analogy I apply to young dairy farmers is why, when this money is so valuable, that's what you have to sell as your labor, is that get something that's highly efficient and don't waste your time milking in inefficient systems, because you got to turn that dollar, because at some point in time you got to turn your labor into cash, which you can turn into capital, that you can get your money working for you. So it's not just your labor over time if you really want to become a millionaire model producer.
So what are some of the efficiencies that these parlors have, or what are some of the inefficiencies that somebody may have in a current system that could be overcome by one of these low-cost parlors?
Okay, so a lot of milking parlors, we tend to train our cows not to come into these parlors just because of the way they're designed. So there's a lot of cow psychology, I would say, in a lot of these milking parlors. And so cows like to walk uphill. Cows like to respond to light, and they like to respond to openness. Okay, so these parlors are definitely a lot more open than a lot of parlors that you would buy on the market. When you take a look at the lighting, if we're going from a well-lit holding area to a dim parlor. Cows aren't going to be attracted to go that way. If cows are walking downhill, they're going to tend to hold themselves back, especially if we're trying to push on them a little bit. So there's a lot of things, just with the efficiency of getting these cows into the parlor and helping them leave. But in addition to the efficiency, we also have the ergonomic part of it is just, how much back bends and even just moving your head forward 2 or 3 inches, on 60 cows, doing that so many times a day. So how that splash guard or the manure pan is actually designed or misdesigned can actually have a big impact on the ergonomics of it. And then I've been into a lot of parlors that were built, and you just take a look at, boy, I sure would not let my son or daughter milk in that parlor if I'm going to worry about their dental looks over time. And so there's issues like with kick rails and things like that people shouldn't have to risk being kicked when they're milking a cow. And so between the back legs is undoubtedly the safest way to milk a cow. Having a kick rail just above the hock on that leg is pretty important, but sometimes people move it just thinking they'll know better, 2 or 3 inches above, and now that cow can actually kick a young girl that might be in that milking pit just because of where that kick rail is placed. So I think there's just a lot of, whether it be call it psychology or just different types of designs in these milking parlors that can be done, and it doesn't really cost much to actually do it, but it's just the thought process of getting it done. So there's a dual slope on the floor, so there's a 2% slope on these parlors going up towards the front, and there's also a 2% slope going down towards the head on the cows. So you got that 2% dual slope, which causes cows to actually back up for you and actually spread their back legs for you a little bit. So just simple things like that in the design, I think, can make a big difference in the parlor.
2% slope toward the brisket rail,
down.
2% slope also toward the front of the pit,
okay. So right to the front of the parlor, the front of the pit, but that's 2% going up. Mm-hmm. The one going towards the head is actually going down.
Okay, so you're going up the parlor when the cow comes in. She's actually walking uphill at 2 degrees.
And when she
or
turns,
2%.
Her front feet are going to go down 2%,
and that will push the udder back a little bit as she's standing downhill.
It'll make the cow back up, up against the rail.
She'll kind of hold herself up that way.
Mm-hmm. I knew pretty much everybody that puts a parlor in does that, but I never knew what the actual percentage was.
Sure.
And
if you have the actually going downhill, people complain about manure in the parlor. If I get a phone call and says I'm getting so much manure in my parlor, my first question is going to be, which way is the floor sloped? And I can guarantee you 90% of the answers are that the floor is sloped downwards. So the other thing they do in these parlors is that we kind of train cows not to come into the parlor, because what do we do when the cows don't come in? We always just jump out and get them. Okay, so every time you do that, you kind of train the cow, well, I don't have to go in there until they're going to come out and get me anyway. So that's one thing that tends to happen. And then the other thing that happens is that humans tend to work at a higher or faster pace than what cows do. And so what's our natural thought is that when the first set leaves the parlor, what do? We jump out of the pit, or we try to rush these cows against faster than they want to go to come into the milking parlor, versus just focus on finishing up the other side or getting 3 or 4 cows into that parlor and start working on those cows there, and just let the rest of those cows just naturally come into that parlor, and then we shut the gate. Okay, so everybody wants to empty it out and then fill it up and then shut the gate and then start milking, which I tend to say is a very bad practice, because those cows don't work on that same time frame. Okay, they want to come in a little slower on their own time, so let's start milking those front cows and then just let them kind of fall in. And it's nice to have that crowd gate behind them, so even while we're milking the cows and trying to prep those first few cows, we can be hitting a button on the crowd gate that's making a sound and actually encouraging those cows to come forward.
Would you say swing or low line?
So I get asked that question a lot, and even the biggest milking equipment people that specialize in the industry in New Zealand are still having an argument on this 40 years later. So it's kind of like what kind of brand of car you're going to buy. So it's kind of a personal preference. And so these trans-Iowa low-cost parlors, you can put the low line into them, you can put the swing line into them. I think there's a lot of low lines that get put in with the misunderstanding that they're more efficient than the swing lines. And so there is a little bit of a difference. So if we're going to go with a swing line, it's going to take about a swing 10 to equal the throughput on a doubled up 8. So everybody says, well, weren't you better to build a smaller parlor? I usually tend to say no, because now I need 16 units instead of just needing 10 units. Okay, so I need more units, more rubberware and all that stuff, and maintaining that many units and cleaning up and getting them ready at the beginning of milking, cleaning them up at the end of the milking. So I would tend to prefer a swing, and I think I've got enough producers that have had. In fact, I've got one that had a swing line in to begin with and thought he could get more throughput with the doubled up. He put the doubled up in, and he sure wishes he would have had a swing back. And so when he doubled his herd size, instead of having the swing 10 or the doubled up 10, he went with the swing 20 and said there's no reason he'd ever double them back up. So we've got a few examples like that, and we've got some other people that have taken the swings out and put them doubled up, and they're happy with it. So who are we to argue if that's what they want and that's what they're happy with? They're happy, I'm happy.
In my region, I would say probably 75% of the cows are milked in a raised parlor, and it's pretty much all of them are, kind of the homemade. There's a couple local companies that make them, much like the parlor you're talking about, and most of them are small, swing 6, but they're running a cow a minute, 60 cows an hour. In a swing 6, which is that's moving.
That's good.
And but what I've noticed is, because a lot of these are younger Amish families with kids in the parlor, in the pit, so those little swing arms, that I think is it maybe a Dairy Master where the hoses run through the little swing arm.
Yep.
Man, does that change the middle of the parlor, because now you don't have those hoses drooping down, but they're coming out and down to the cow. Oh, I just can't see why people don't all have them.
Yeah, so I think the swing arm part is extremely important, because when you take a look at those that don't have swing arms, your unit alignment on the cow tends to not be very good as well, so you're going to tend to get more squawking, this, that, and the other thing. And so if you're going to put in a swing parlor, by all means, sometimes it only takes $10 a stall to create a piece of pipe that actually swivels. There's pictures of that on the internet as well. That swivels, and you can actually hang your takeoffs right on there. But the nice part is once you start having the swing arm in there, if that cow moves or she's 6 inches this milking more than she was last milking in one direction or the other, that swing arm is going to tend to move with her. So I think it's a pretty important piece. But the biggest downfall, I think, of swing parlors, especially early on, is the unit alignment, because we didn't have the swing arms. But once we got those figured out, I think it's going to change that process.
And I think a lot of people don't have the swing arms simply because of the cost. And I think if you're building a new parlor, what's another couple $100 or whatever? But
yeah, so when you take a look at, if they see pictures of these things, you can build them yourself. A lot of times people have the steel even available on their farm. They just got to figure out how to get that swivel working, that they can make it. So I tend to say if you spend more than $10, $15 on a decent swing arm, that's a lot of steel.
What is cost overall of I know it's a wide variation, but of a low cost parlor like you're talking versus a commercially available, you see on some of these bigger facilities, the rapid exit, that kind of thing. What kind of cost variation are we talking?
If we're looking at a swing 8 or a swing 10 right now, I would tend to say if a producer does at least part of the labor, say maybe a third of the labor themselves or even half the labor themselves, I've seen them, still for $20,000 put it in a swing 8 or swing 10. So I built my swing 10 for $12,000. It's been 15 years ago now. But when you take a look at, the bottom line is that you've got steel that's probably in a swing 8 or swing 10 that's worth $32,000 to maybe even up to $4,000. You've got about 15 yards of cement in that system. That's what's going to run you $1,800 or something like that. And the rest of it's going to be forming things up, this, that, and the other thing. So material-wise, you can still build a lot of parlor for less than $10,000 without the actual milking equipment.
And what kind of cost are we talking for a commercially available rapid exit or something like that?
You're going to be looking at $250,000, if not $400,000. But a lot of times you're putting in a brand new shell and things like that. And the beauty, I think, of these low-cost parlors is that you can put them into a stall barn. And I'll just use an example of our own family. So they built a building for a rotary robot at some point in time. But instead, realizing that with the way the organic pay prices were, they didn't think they could really cash flow it at the time, so they decided to put in one of these lower cost swing 20 parlors, and so they're getting 140, 150 cows milked per person per hour out of that thing. And the last response that I had back from them when they were kind of talking about milking efficiencies is, well, this thing's working so darn good for us, we can't see ourselves ever putting the rotary robots in.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can't argue with happiness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. Thanks a lot, Larry. We appreciate it. And this was definitely really interesting. And thanks for sitting down with us.
Appreciate the invitation and best wishes.